Hello and welcome to this week's IG Live. Today we are going to be talking to a longtime MKB member, Anneke Forzani of Language Lizard. And if you read our blog, you know that Language Lizard does a lot of blog posts for us, and they've been a member for a very long time. So we're going to be talking to her about her work and what inspired it. I know a lot of you are already supporters of bilingualism and multilingualism. So she has a lot of insight to share about what it's like to work in the classroom these days, as far as what support you can find. Hearing more about that, and also just the benefits in terms of education, getting some more ideas about that, about why it's important to read to your child in any language at home. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Well,
It's awesome to see you again.
it is great to see you. And I should mention that we just spoke, I guess, was that last week? We talked on Makeaway Media. So you guys can
Yes.
go. I'm trying not to repeat too much of what we did in that interview. So if you like this one, go back and watch the Makeaway Media interview, because we talk a lot more about how by having a bilingual classroom is an inclusive classroom and how to make children feel welcome by having materials available in different languages. So go watch that one. We're going to try and not repeat too much today, but why don't we start off? You can introduce yourself, and for those that don't know you and what you do.
Sure. Yes, I'm Anneke Forzani. I'm the founder and the president of Language Lizard, and I'm also the author of 5 bilingual children's books and a teacher's manual about using bilingual books and multicultural resources to support diverse classrooms. And Language Lizard, which I founded, about 18 years ago, I guess now, is a children's book publishing and distribution company, and we offer books and free teaching resources in over 60 languages.
And so I'm glad you mentioned that over 60 languages, because I think even those of us that have worked with you for a long time, it was still surprising to me when I saw that number, and it keeps going up. I think you're getting pretty close to 70 now, right?
Yes. In fact, we just launched Mongolian, and I need to count again, but I think that might bring us to 70.
That's amazing. And I know one of the things I love about your company is that you're so responsive to what you hear from teachers about what they need. So that number is always going up. But why don't we go back first and talk about what was the need that you saw when you started Language Lizard, and how is Language Lizard addressing that need?
Well, I would say there were really 3 major needs that we were addressing when we started the company. First, there was this need to support both academic and social development of immigrants and refugees that come from many diverse ethnicities. So really trying to reach a lot of different children. Second, which was actually very closely related, there was a need to build more opportunities for parent and child interactions and parental involvement in learning, particularly for many of these ethnic and immigrant groups. And third, we felt there was a need, and especially after talking to teachers and some professors who work with teachers, that there was really a need to help teachers build more inclusive classrooms and help them to sort of build community in these diverse classrooms by educating both language learners and monolingual students, and finding ways to do that that wouldn't really add to the already heavy workloads that the teachers have. So that was sort of the needs we were kind of trying to address. And so what we kind of did to address these needs, and what we're continuing to do. So first, as I mentioned, we're trying to provide bilingual resources in many languages, so both the more common and the many hard to find languages. And we're also, so what we're trying to do there is to provide reading and literacy building experiences for many different ethnic and language groups. And then we've been supplementing many of the books, and we talked about this last time as well a bit, but we've been supplementing many of the books with teaching resources for educators to help them with culturally inclusive teaching. So in other words, not only will they have the books with a second language, but they'll have very actionable materials like detailed lessons, activities, worksheets, etc., that would incorporate teaching of other languages and cultures as part of the content that they need to teach. So we're not looking at this as you have to do something extra. It's more, how can you do what you're doing, but incorporate culture into it? And by doing this, it will help the immigrants' children feel more included and help their self-esteem. So really help building not only the academic, but the social development of these children. And then the teaching resource and the activities will also help the entire class learn more about their classmates, develop a better understanding of other cultures, help them develop empathy, etc. And then the teaching resources and the books will also, the other idea behind it was that it would provide ways to connect parents more closely with the children's teaching. So that could be like as simple as having a bilingual book lending library. So a lot of the teachers we work with will create lending libraries with different languages. So kids can read a book in class, say in English with the teacher, and then the child can take the bilingual version of the book home, read it and discuss it with their parents. It could encompass having a parent who speaks a language other than English read it in class, or it could even be doing like some of the activities that we talk about in the lessons where students would interact with their families when doing an assignment and then have the opportunity to share some of their culture with the class. So sort of the books with the teaching resource together really provide a lot of ideas for improving literacy, bringing culture into the classroom, and including families, all sort of getting to the three needs we were trying to address.
Right, and I think that's so interesting because a lot of times, you know, we just recently finished the month of the bilingual child, and one of the things we talked about is that people usually focus on the child, which makes sense, but there's also a whole community around the child that we need to talk about, like the teachers. And I think you're also bringing in the element, especially into the classroom, that's often missed, is the connection to the families, which I imagine, like you said, is especially important when you're talking about refugee families or minority families who are often kind of feel disconnected from what is happening in the classroom, or might have other kind of hurdles in communication with knowing what's happening in the classroom. And so you're really helping bridge that gap and helping them feel more welcome and included. And you kind of talked about this a little bit, but I just love the idea about this idea that bilingual materials help build a more inclusive classroom. Like what does it mean for a refugee child, for example, to come into their new classroom and then they see a book that's in their home language?
Well, that's something actually I get a lot of feedback on from both the teachers we work with as well as a lot of the nonprofit organizations that give free books to refugee children, immigrant children. So like for the children, it's really kind of an immediate sign. You get a book in your language or you see a book in your language in your class. It's an immediate sign of being seen, of being welcomed. And then, you know, it's not only the child, it's the parent, right? So parents are so happy and often so surprised to see that their culture or their language is being recognized. There was actually an interesting article in Language Magazine this summer. It was by Valentina Gonzalez, and I kind of re-looked at it recently. And it started by saying, when you were a young reader, did you connect with the books you read and the stories you heard? Did you find yourself between the pages? Were your experiences validated? And it really made me think back to that time, like think about when you were a young reader, right? And the books you enjoyed, you kind of felt like you were being seen or being heard, or you felt sort of a sense of belonging, probably in reading your favorite books. And so many of us probably on this call have been in situations where our language and our culture was incorporated in what we were learning. But imagine if it wasn't, right? What would it mean to suddenly have books that do reflect your language and your experiences? You know, wouldn't that make you feel included? Wouldn't it affect your engagement in class? Maybe you'd be more open to participating in class if you could share your experiences or how you relate to a book. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about that kind of like relates to your question a bit is considering that while our country has become so much more diverse, there's also unfortunately been a rise in nationalism and sort of this empowered anti-immigrant groups. And so really a lot of immigrant families and refugees and migrants, they're facing a lot of like negative effects of racism and anti-immigrant sentiment around the country. And that does impact students for sure. So I feel like there's really kind of an urgent need to mitigate the negative effects that this racism could be having on the educational experiences of immigrant students. So I feel like, sometimes you feel overwhelmed looking at the news and like, what can you do? And there's so many problems. But I guess I feel, if we can all play our own part, and then teachers play a huge part. And I feel that just providing books in the language and instilling a respect for diverse cultures and languages among classmates, helping, teachers building culturally responsive classrooms with those materials can really help to sort of mitigate some of the negative effects.
Absolutely. And especially the piece you're talking about. I mean, of course, we know that it's important for the immigrant children, the refugee children, to have books that are available in their home languages. But as you said, it's also important for the monolingual students in the classroom to be exposed to these foreign language materials, to these bilingual materials. I know you mentioned even just seeing that there are other scripts that exist, and maybe sparking that curiosity. Why is it so important for the monolingual students in the classroom as well? Because I think a lot of times it's often presented as like an accommodation for the new students in the classroom, as opposed to thinking of it as a benefit for the monolingual students also.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and definitely something, when we as a company started working on a lot of the lesson plans that I've talked about, we were working with a lot of teachers who had been in primarily teaching monolingual classrooms. Well, a professor who was actually a grad teaching a lot of these teachers who came back to get their masters. And they said, they were used to working in monolingual classrooms. Now there's diverse classrooms, but they really wanted to sort of address the issue of building community where you're reaching not just the new language learners, not just the new immigrants, but also the monolinguals. And so really, wherever you live now, and whether or not your family's bilingual or multilingual or monolingual, our kids are going to definitely be exposed to children from all over the world, right? So the risk and what can happen is that kids from other areas are seen as, or let's say the non-majority kids, right, are seen as different or other with something of a negative connotation. But I feel that it definitely doesn't have to be that way. So diversity can and should be seen as a strength, right? Not only is it interesting, just plain old interesting to learn about other cultures and languages, you can get better results in a project with more different perspectives. You'll be exposed to different ideas, which is a good thing. So I feel like if all children, including monolingual speakers, can hear stories about people who are different from them, it can really help build community. So for some kids, the book, we always talk about books as mirrors and windows, right? So for some kids, the book will be a mirror where they are seeing themselves reflected, or their language or their culture reflected. For other kids, it will be more of a window where they're learning about another culture. But in doing so, you're going to help them build empathy for the characters and build an understanding of the experience of others. So, I know we've talked about some of the books and some examples, but like if I give you an example, our book, Be Kind, right? So we have a book, it's a really popular book, very simple book. And many teachers have discussions around kindness, right? And it's common for schools to have programs, or especially around Kindness Week, et cetera, where they're encouraging kindness. But what if we can now incorporate culture and diversity in those discussions, right? So if you take a book like our bilingual book, Be Kind, right? This shows discussions that go beyond just the themes of kindness, right? So a teacher or a parent can provide opportunities to discuss not only the meaning and the importance of kindness, but to enhance the child's understanding of diverse communities locally and globally. And so, like with that book, when we built our lesson plan, we tried to make it easier for teachers or families, because it will describe the background of the illustrations that have, it might be, for example, two Taiwanese kids playing. Well, now looking at that thing, that it's actually like a traditional Taiwanese doll that they're playing with, for example, right? So it provides lots of exercises, by seeing the background of the illustrations and looking at the exercise in the classroom, there's a lot of, or in the lesson plan, there's a lot of opportunities to build sort of community in the classroom. And then you take that same book, and now a teacher can offer that book in over 40 languages. So they're talking about kindness in school, and looking at the different cultures. Now they can take it home, and maybe they have a parent who doesn't speak English well, they can read the book with their parent and they can discuss it with their families also. So now they're getting that connection. So I just think that with bilingual books and multicultural stories, you can really include a diverse range of cultures in all aspects of learning. And again, the idea is not to give more work to teachers, it's just incorporating in what they're doing already. And by doing so, you're going to be able to build a more close-knit community that's welcoming to students of all backgrounds, where diversity isn't just sort of accepted, but it's celebrated, and where all the students feel safe and feel valued and respected.
I love that, and especially like you said, when just to pick out a few points from what you said about not making more work for teachers, because as we know, they're already so overburdened, but you're actually in some ways making their job easier because you're kind of giving them ready-made lesson plans and teaching them how to incorporate this and kind of solve a problem in a way that they're often having to deal with without really having much resources to do it. So you're providing those resources, but again, making that connection between linguistic diversity and cultural diversity, which there is a lot of talk about diverse books, but it doesn't necessarily include linguistic diversity, which is a really important part of it. But also to go back to the part about connecting to the families, something we had kind of touched on in our last interview is the idea that of how important it is to be reading with your kids at home, even if it's a language and other than English. And, we kind of mentioned that before, that sometimes immigrant parents are really hesitant to read, and they feel like they need to read or talk to their kids in English, which can hold them back if they feel like their language skills in English aren't very strong. But could you talk a little bit more about, you mentioned that even if you're not reading in English, that actually helps the kids in the classroom with their language skills. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, and I know we talked about it a little before, but it is, I think, a really important point and sort of a myth that's constantly we're trying to debunk. So, everybody pretty much knows now, right, about the research that suggests that high quality literacy environments with lots of reading, lots of language interactions early on have a really strong positive effect on a child's school success. But what's really important to note is that this is the case irregardless of the language that's spoken at home, or what's read at home. So for a long time, there was a common misconception that if a child doesn't speak English or comes from a non-English speaking home and they need to learn English, you don't want to confuse them. So you should really focus on English. And so with that misconception, a lot of parents who didn't speak or read English well, a lot of the immigrant families didn't want to, quote, confuse their child. So they really didn't read a lot to them. But this idea has definitely been debunked. And so research really over now, many years has shown that literacy in the first language actually facilitates the development of the second language. So many literacy skills will transfer over, such as language and print awareness, phonemic awareness, cognate knowledge, even vocabulary skills like interpreting metaphors, etc. So the thing that people need to remember is that language minority parents, they really are willing and they are able to help their children succeed. And sometimes I think this is underestimated. So now the recommendation really for parents is to read. Just read to your kids from the beginning, from birth. Read in the language that you're most comfortable in. Have a lot of books around. Go to the library. Read and talk about what you're reading. And doing that all in the home language is fine. It's great. It's just having that literacy rich environment. And there's been a lot of, it's hard for us to sometimes understand, but there's like a lot of families who, can't even really afford to have, having lots of books in the house is just not like a luxury they can afford. So there's been a lot of great organizations that have been giving books to kids. And it used to be just English books, but actually we work with a lot of them. So now they're doing it in more diverse languages. And I think that's like phenomenal. And people can ever donate to those organizations. It's really great. And I think because people have recognized the importance of that. But even for families who can't maybe afford a lot of books, like libraries are getting much better at stocking books in different languages. We work with libraries all over the country. And honestly, they respond to what their communities are asking for. So if families are going to the libraries and saying, we need this, that's what the library is gonna start stocking. So people really shouldn't hesitate to go to the librarians either and ask to get more language
Yeah,
books.
librarians, I'm glad you mentioned that because librarians are such a great resource, like you said, in terms of just going and asking if you're not sure how to access the materials or letting them know what materials that you need. They are so responsive. And I know we're in a metropolitan area with, I don't know, I don't even know how many libraries we have in the area. And different ones, but depending on what's in their community, like there are certain ones that tend to have a lot of Spanish language materials, another one have more Russian, another might have
Okay.
more Farsi, depending on what the local. So even if your local library doesn't have a lot of materials in your language, there might be one in your area. And if you talk to the librarian, they might be able to easily access, or like you said, then they might decide that they need to stock more in the language. So that's a really great point. And just again about this idea, I mean, it's so unfortunate because I think the message a lot of these parents were getting is that they had to speak English and had to read in English with their kids. And if they didn't feel comfortable in that,
Yeah.
the end result was a lot of times they weren't doing any reading with them because they were afraid that they were going to do something wrong. So I
Yeah.
love this message. And like you said, there are so many resources available, especially from you guys. And to talk about that a little bit, about the resources that you have, you were so well known among teachers for having these dual language materials, especially and materials in language that are less common and harder to find. So you're operating in this space about bilingual materials. Do you still run into much resistance? Like what is, you kind of have your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the classroom. Are teachers facing a lot of resistance to providing bilingual materials? Is there more of a demand from it? Does it kind of depend on what part of the country you're talking about? Like, how has the landscape changed since you started? I think you said like 18 years ago. How has it changed?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, so I personally don't feel like I faced a lot of resistance early on. I feel like the teachers in diverse classrooms have always been happy to have books to share in less common languages and ways to get parents involved. I think what I have seen is a couple of things. So um, there's a lot, like we talked about, there's a lot of vitriol outside of the teaching space, right? And you just have to read the newspaper to see the kind of discriminatory attitudes towards immigrants that are being given a voice and sometimes a loud voice. But it seems that in some ways, this has actually strengthened the resolve of the people who are actually working with dual language children, people who are seeing them as sort of human beings, not just a statistic, human beings with a right to learn and to be valued. And teachers know that they have an important role in sort of combating some of the hate that's out there and helping children learn about and appreciate diversity and respect for all cultures. So I really, admire the work that the teachers are doing. I know years ago, I would say like 8 years ago or so, the Migration Policy Institute, MPI, they put out like a lot of great reports about immigration, et cetera. And they did a report that was examining the types of discrimination among children of immigrant families and the negative impact that had on their school experiences. And they talked about, all different kind of personal structural discrimination. I won't get into that a lot, but there were recommendations that came out of the study that were, some were much more focused on high level educational policy, but it did also address a number of strategies that can be acted upon by educators in day-to-day classroom activities that would alleviate some forms of discrimination and also just enhance the educational experience of immigrant children. And so like one of the recommendations, for example, was incorporating the community's diverse cultures and their linguistic heritage into instruction through lesson plans, games, crafts, etc., and emphasizing the value of speaking another language and maintaining a connection with one's heritage, etc. So I think that over the years, more teachers have experienced diverse classrooms and have been to conferences, et cetera, where they've talked about the recommendations of this report. So in fact, I feel like as we've introduced more languages and as we put more effort into creating the lesson plans to support the culturally inclusive classrooms, we've actually had in some ways more interest than ever before. And it may be sort of a result of everything that's happening kind of outside of the classroom as well. So yeah, so in some ways, it's nice to see the positive, maybe outweighing or a counteract to some of the negative.
Yeah, that's good to hear for those of us who aren't as in touch with what's happening across the country in all these different classrooms. That's really nice to hear. If you just watch the news, it can be very discouraging. So you have all these resources available. If people want to access it, how can they do that? What do you have available? And especially, I know you're launching a new website very soon, so that's going to make it even easier for people to find the materials.
Yes, I'm so excited. I can't wait. We're going to launch that new website in a couple of weeks. And I mean, it's essentially, it's not really a news website, I should say, redesigned website. And I think we've had pretty good feedback so far that it's fairly easy to find what we have. Bilingual books, lesson plans that go with the books. We have a lot of interactive materials, some audio materials, etc. I think the new website will make it even easier for customers to find what they're looking for. There will be more illustrations from our books throughout the site. And I think the biggest advantage will be a lot of these free lesson plans and free resources are going to be much easier to find to help the teachers and the homeschool families. So I will say that when we launch, which should be, like I said, in about 2 weeks, we're going to do a special giveaway. So people who aren't already on our newsletter list should subscribe because then they'll get more information about it so they can be included in it and hopefully win some of our books.
Yes, if you go to the link in their bio, you can get to the website, or we will also, when we share this on YouTube, we'll make sure to share the direct link to how you subscribe to the newsletter. And it's very exciting because you do offer, we were talking about how responsive librarians are. You are very responsive. I mean, a lot of how the Language Lizard resource library has expanded has been because you're so responsive to what teachers say that they need. When you start hearing that they need a different language, then you find a way to provide that. So I thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and for taking the time to talk to us today. And like I said, we'll provide the links and the YouTube video. If you're joining us late, this will be up in just a few minutes on Instagram and later on our YouTube channel.
Thank you so much, Leanna. Thanks for having me.
So
Great
good
connecting with everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.